Welcome to Dilli Dali. I am S. Gopalakrishnan. In this episode of the podcast, I have a special guest with me to talk about a very special book. The book is special to me because of many reasons, and that is what we would love to bring to this edition of Dilli Dali. The guest is Professor Vinay Lal, a historian of India, who is a professor of history at the University of California, Los Angeles. Professor Vinay Lal writes widely on history and culture of colonial and modern India. And the book that we are going to talk about today is his latest work, a substantial work, I would say, Insurgency and the Artist, the Art of the Freedom Struggle in India. Congratulations, Professor Vinay Lal, for this significant work and thank you for giving this quality time for this podcast. Welcome, Professor Vinay Lal.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.
And at the very outset, I should thank you for your quality time. I know, we are talking at the different time zones, and therefore, I'm specially thanking you for taking this time out of your very busy schedule. And the book Insurgency and the Artist, The Art of the Freedom Struggle in India, came out when India entered into the 75th year of independence from the British colonial rule. This compelling book talks about how politically engaged art during the freedom struggle and its wide range of trajectories. And the period is not just the early half of the 20th century, just before the Indian independence, but it starts from 1857 onwards. That is very special about this particular book. And Professor Vinay Lal, can you say what prompted you to write such an extensive work with deep focus and research?
Well, all right. So let me very briefly describe the origins of this work. I had initially thought 15 years ago.
Okay.
Maybe even a little bit longer, maybe 20 years ago, about doing a book on Gandhi and the image, the politics of the image.
Okay.
Because what I have seen over the years is that there is a very large number of visual representations of Gandhi. For example, most of which are not at all discussed or included in the book. They're not even hinted at. Over the years, I have developed an archive of, I would say something like maybe 30 to 50,000 images of Gandhi, distinct images. So, for example, I had a research assistant who helped me find cartoons of Gandhi published in Dutch, French, German, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese.
And I loved the Jesse Hill cartoon on Gandhi, which you reproduced in the book.
Yes. So there were a huge number of cartoons from the 1920s and 30s. None of which has ever been discussed in the literature. So originally it started as a project which was really going to be focused entirely on Gandhi. But then about 6-7 years ago, as I describe in the opening pages of the book, the then publisher, now his daughter has taken over, but the then publisher of Roli Books, Pramod Kapoor, who had himself written what is, in my view, a very interesting book on Gandhi. It's some people would describe it as more of a coffee table book, but it's a book which brings in the images of Gandhi, photographs, and various other kinds of images, mainly photographs, though. He had himself done a book on Gandhi, and he approached me and he said, "We would like you to do something if you're willing to accept this assignment, as it were, something which would be on the freedom struggle in India." Instead of just Gandhi. Now, I'm a historian of India. I've been teaching history at UCLA close to 30 years. This June, I'll complete 30 years on the faculty at the University of California. And I've written on Gandhi very extensively over the course of the last 35, 40 years. So I thought to myself, it would be a challenge. There is some work of the kind that I've done. I think one should always credit one's predecessors.
Yeah, let me ask a question. Let me ask a question. Whether there were any works by others in of this size or this
Right.
focus?
So that's what I'm coming to. So there are works by I have some predecessors, but the nature of the work is quite different. So I'll give you
Yes.
the two principal illustrations of that. So there is a scholar whose work is very formidable. I'm very fond of his work, although I have some critical observations about his work in my book. I'm speaking about Christopher Pinney,
Yes, yes.
who wrote a book some 20 years ago, Camera Indica, which is the social life of photographs in India.
Yes, yes.
And then after that, he wrote Photos of the Gods,
Yes.
which is where this book overlaps with that, but there is a significant difference.
Yes.
The significant difference can be described in several respects. One is that he is looking at these, what I call nationalist prints, which I also discuss. Chromolithographs, lithographs, these are relatively speaking mass produced. I mean, they're not mass produced in the sense in which modern posters might be mass produced of millions of copies, but there would have been perhaps some few thousands of copies of each particular print.
Yes.
He's dealing with those, and he goes well beyond the end of independence. He goes into the Indira Gandhi period as well.
Okay.
Whereas I confine myself, number one, to work produced between 1858, 1857-58, the rebellion of 1857-58, and I end essentially with the assassination of Gandhi.
Yes.
The assassination of Gandhi on 30th January 1948.
Yes.
So the first thing to understand about this book is that it is confined to work that was produced in that period. There are only 3 or 4 exceptions out of the 200 plus images. There are only 3 or 4 exceptions there, but the book is really confined to work that was produced at that time. So I'm looking at how artists contemporary to the struggle were thinking about the nature of the struggle. The second thing is that Christopher Pinney is looking only at these prints, these nationalist prints. I am looking at a much wider array of material, including work done on acrylic and oil. And in fact, the very cover of this book, this image has never been published before. No one knew anything about this artist. His work has never been published. I was able to actually contact his daughter through a certain set of circumstances, and she shared with me this particular image. The second book, a very eminent scholar, and she's worked on this area, but again, the nature of the work is very different. I'm speaking here of Sumati Ramaswamy, who wrote a book which is really on the Bharat Mata image and how it circulated and what were the circuits of circulation, the circuits of representation. But I have a chapter on the Bharat Mata image in my book, but only a chapter. Absolutely. So I'm looking at a much wider array of material. Absolutely. My intent was also to do something quite different, which I don't believe the Christopher Pinney book or Sumati's book does or attempts to do, which is I also wanted to offer a capsule history of the entire movement for freedom from 1857-58 to 1947.
Yes. In fact, this book is a history of Indian freedom struggle from 1857 to 1948.
Exactly. So you can read the history either through the text.
Yes.
But you can read it through the images.
Absolutely.
So the images are not incidental, nor are they simply accompanying the text. Yes. Very often, people think of images as illustrating the text or accompanying the text. The images write their own narrative, and then I have a textual narrative. So there are 2 parallel narratives. At some points they converge, at some points they may not entirely converge, and the book must be understood as a dance between the image and the text.
Now,
You see,
now
it's
in
almost
the
like what I call a jugalbandi between the text and the image. That's how one should look at it.
yes, and in the beginning you mentioned about two works of or people. One is Irving Goffman, who worked on the social construction of self and the sociology of everyday life, and the
Yes,
second is John Berger, the author of The Ways of Seeing, based on the
yes,
1972 BBC television
yes.
series. Can you just mention in few sentences about the importance of these two while looking at the politics of art?
Well, yes, but you see, if you look at if you think about what I said there, see, I was simply conveying the intellectual journey of such as someone such as myself. That is, at this stage in my life, how did I come to something like this?
Hmm.
So when I reflect back
Yes.
on my undergraduate education, I went to a university called Johns Hopkins University,
Hmm.
and I started my undergraduate education in 1978. And I remember almost to the day, when I read a book by Irving Goffman called Gender Advertisements.
Hmm.
Since the time I read that book, I've never looked at it again. Let me also say that. Okay.
Yes.
But sometimes books leave some kind of lingering impression on you.
Yes.
And one of the impressions it left on me was that even when we look at advertisements, most people look at them very innocuously. But there is always a politics to everything. There is a politics of knowledge in how, for example, advertisements are framed. One of the things that Irving Goffman, for example, illustrated through all the gender advertisements that he had was how women are shown as holding objects very differently than men.
Yes.
When women hold an object, it is almost as though they're about to lose grasp over it. The suggestion being that they don't quite have a grasp over reality. Advertisements are gendered. That's what Goffman was saying. The women will appear in advertisements in a much more frivolous fashion sometimes. And you have to remember that this book goes back to 4 or 5 decades.
Yes.
When sexism was absolutely rampant, especially in advertising, especially in the advertising world, it was just completely rampant. And the assumption was that, well, women are simply shoppers, they never create anything, they're just consumers.
Yes.
You see, right? So now I'm not working, of course, with that model. What I'm working with, rather,
In
the
fact,
idea.
you very rigorously you argue such a point when you come to that chapter dedicated to Rani of Jhansi.
The Rani of Jhansi. Yes,
Yes.
yes, yes,
Yes.
yes. Yeah. What I am actually, those two books by Goffman and by John Berger I mentioned because that was the beginnings
Yes.
of my engagement with the image as something that one can study in
Okay.
certain ways, right? And what we call the visual turn in scholarship, the visual turn came to India much later.
Much later.
Much
Okay.
later. The visual turn is where one begins to understand the nature of the image, the politics of the image, how it circulates, how it creates a representational field, as we would say, and what is the relationship between that representational field and other bodies of knowledge,
Okay.
right?
Now
That's the context in which I mentioned it.
now just for the people who are yet to read the book. The book is made in 11 chapters and 4 boxes. It starts with the art of the freedom struggle and the historian, a brilliant, introductory chapter. Then the second chapter is on the rebellion of 1857 and its aftermath. Then it talks about the Tilak period. Then it goes to 3 or 4 chapters of the emergence of Gandhi into Indian freedom struggle. Then it comes to political oppression. Then goes to Bhagat Singh, Hindu mythography. Then the emergence of the political religious mythography around Bharat Mata, and then to 1947, then to Gandhi assassination. The book goes like this. Now, my question is about the classification, whether the history of the art movement related to the freedom struggle uh, followed such a political chronology parallel to what was happening in the political arena.
Yes. So there are a number of considerations that are important here. First, I am not certain, and I would not make the claim that we can speak about an art movement, to use the
Yes.
phrase that you used.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
I'm not certain that we can speak about an art movement. In
Mm.
fact, I would go so far as to say, and I discussed this very briefly in the beginning of the book. All right. I go so far as to say that even the word artist, see, when we use a word in Hindi, let's just take Hindi. I know that, of course, Tamil and Telugu and Kannada, Oriya, all of them, they may have other words. Certainly, I think there will be cognate words in the other Indo-European, Indo-Aryan languages, but Bangla, Marathi, Gujarati. So the word that we use, for example, is kalakar.
Yes.
Okay, but kalakar, you see, it doesn't translate quite into, because a kalakar can also be a craftsman in
Yes.
a way.
Yes.
Okay. Now, you see, when we are thinking of art in Europe, by the 19th century, we have to understand it was a very different world than anything you found in India. Because by the 19th century, the art world in Europe included a whole range of people that, frankly,
will you allow me to read a small sentence from your book?
sure.
What I have discovered is that a philosophical exploration of what is implied by terms such as art and artists in colonial India at a time when in Europe the market of art was already well developed and involved a complicated matrix of painters, sculptors, consumers, buyers, patrons, agents, collectors, art critics, curators, museologists, conservators, and suppliers of art materials is very much wanting.
Exactly. You
Yes.
see that we cannot speak of that complex
Yes.
which around which the art world is shaped in India as we could in Europe.
Absolutely.
And the artist had no profession as such in India. You
Yes.
couldn't make a living.
Yes.
There might be one or two individuals, literally. Raja Ravi Verma later on is going to be able to, you could say, if he wanted, make a living purely from this.
Yes.
But even a Tagore, Govindranath Tagore, people like
Yes.
that, you couldn't make a living from that. Almost nobody did. It was unthinkable. So we have to think of art and the artist in a different register of thought.
Register thought.
When we are, all right, and so you have to allow a certain capaciousness in our use of the word art, and certainly we cannot speak of an art movement. Now, going back to the chapters and what
Yes.
you sort of read out as a chronology,
Ah.
so the chapters really follow, in a sense, the chronology of what you might describe to some degree as the freedom movement itself.
Yes.
So that's why the chapter on Tilak precedes the chapters on Gandhi, because
Yes.
literally he preceded Gandhi. But it's not strictly that way either, because notice something here. See that when you come to someone like Tilak, and this has very much a bearing on the present moment, literally the present moment. Recall what has happened very recently in the last few days.
Yes.
And there's been a lot of discussion about that the NCERT has completely altered textbooks, eviscerated the Muslim past. Now, our Prime Minister a few months ago gave a speech where he said that even after independence for decades, and what he really means to say is until he became the Prime Minister, until 2014, the history we were taught was all colonial history. That's what he's really saying.
Yes.
Which is not correct, of course. But the point is that he actually explicitly states in a speech that he gives on November 22nd, I think it was somewhere around that time last year, where he says that, we are always told about all the defeats that were inflicted on us, but we also won a lot of victories. Okay. Now, this is the resurrection of a real or imagined martial past.
Yes.
Right? Yes. That we had these great martial heroes. See, some of these nationalist prints,
yes,
going back to 1900, you begin to see prints of Shivaji. You begin to see prints of Maharana Pratap. Right? And these prints can be linked later on to prints of Subhash Bose, similar kind of prints. For
Yes, yes.
example, Subhash Bose appearing before the goddess, and the goddess
That
confers
that is the,
us.
the same Bhavani in front of
That's
Shivaji and Bose. You use
that's
those
right.
prints.
Uh,
Yes,
that's right. The Astra Dan, the
yes,
gift of the weapons.
yes,
You see,
yes,
now this is the idea of resurrecting the martial past.
yes,
A- Okay, well, as I say, a real or imagined martial past that we want, and this is a reaction. We must understand this. It's a reaction to what colonial writers for close to 200 years, 150 years, had referred to as the effeminacy of the Hindu. That the Hindu, the Indian more generally, but especially the Hindu, is effeminate. In other words, let me translate this into a related language. There are no men in India. There are women, and then there are men who are all like women. There are no men in India.
yes,
You see, so it became very critically important to resurrect for Indian nationalists this idea that we had great martial heroes.
yes,
Now, here we are not working strictly chronologically. We're working chronologically only in the sense that, yes, it's a chapter on Tilak which speaks about it, and Tilak precedes Gandhi. But Tilak, that age is the age which is now also going back to Shivaji, going back to Maharana Pratap even earlier. Okay, right? That Prithviraj Chauhan, to
yes.
pick another instance. So there is a thematic argument there. And then if you look, there is a whole chapter on what I call Hindu mythography.
Hmm.
You see how, for example, the stories of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata were taken by these printmakers, and how Gandhi's story was woven into these stories.
Yes.
So they
So,
merge into one. There's
no, no,
this
I,
extraordinary.
please allow me to jump a question, because a
Yeah.
question which I was thinking of asking you a little later. But when it comes to the eighth chapter, the freedom and the Hindu mythography, mostly Gandhi was depicted with Vaishnavite images. Uh, but to my surprise, found one amazing image which you have reproduced by Prabhu Dayal, Bharat Udhar, where Bharat Mata, like Markandeya, with
Yeah.
Shivaling, and Gandhi comes as Shiva to protect, but without a snake around his neck.
Yes. 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 That you see that is truly, it is very remarkable because, of course, um, if we think about Gandhi, uh, to the extent that we think of him in relationship to quote Hinduism,
Yes,
we think of Vaishnavism.
yes,
We know that from his childhood, the Vaishnava influence was very strong,
yes,
along with Jain influence, and in many ways we can say, as is true, by the way, of a majority of Hindus, as is true of a majority of Hindus, not all of Hindus, but the Vaishnava influence. India is in some ways a Vaishnava country.
yes,
There's a huge Shaivite presence, and there are great Shaivite cities. Banaras is a Shaivite city in many ways,
yes.
but certainly the Vaishnava presence in some ways uh, is critically important. And but here the printmaker, you see, because this is partly an attempt to be also ecumenical,
Hmm.
because the printmaker was probably most likely aware of the fact that, well, that the Hinduism is only the what I call the corporate category, the aggregated category through which we think about those who are called Hindus. But for most of history, people we call Hindus thought of themselves as Vaishnavas or as Shaivites or Tantrics or Shaktos or Kabir Panthis or Nanak, Gorak Panthis, whatever it might be, Nath Panthis, right? That's how you thought of yourself. You didn't think of yourself necessarily as a Hindu at all. So here, however, we are now in the 20th century. And the printmaker is attempting to be, in some ways, very ecumenical. I don't have an extensive commentary on this in the book, on this question of the Shaivite Vaishnava matter, because I was constrained by the number of words.
Now, Binod Bihari Mukherjee's The Life of Medieval Saints, 1947 and between
Yes.
1946-47, which he made, which is show now exhibited in Shantiniketan's Hindi Bhavan. Here you made a very valid point that the Bhakti movement seemed to offer palpable evidence of cultural fabric that had knit the extreme ends of the country together. Now, as a historian of Gandhi too, what do you think? How much Gandhi was a product of the Bhakti movement? I know it is a deviation from the book, art book, which we are discussing about. But how do you see whether Gandhi was a product of a Bhakti movement, and how do you see a departure from that fabric to the present day politics in India, which using Bhakti for dividing the people rather than unifying the people?
Yes. Well, your question is critically important and will require a very complex answer. But I'll try to keep it short while trying to make at least some of the major points I want to make. Let me begin by saying, and I don't believe that Gandhi has ever been interpreted in this fashion. I don't believe a single scholar has really done it thus far. And I'm not doing it in this book either. But
Yes.
I would like to do a book at some point along the lines of what I'm going to suggest, the point I'm going to make. I see Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi as the last great representative of the Sant tradition of India. Okay, I do see him that way. He also belongs in that tradition. He belongs in many traditions because, of course, he's also an explicitly political figure in many ways. So there are other traditions of dissent, other intellectual traditions that he belongs to, and there are clearly traditions he doesn't belong to, that he disavows. But I see him in many ways as the last great representative of the Sant tradition. Going back really to 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. Now, there are clearly some sants, some of the Bhakti poets who were very dear to him. The most obvious example is, of course, Tulsidas, Ramcharitmanas, a text that Gandhi revered. But let us remember that even as he revered it, and this is what is always so extraordinary about Gandhi, that there is always a critical edge to his thinking. That even as he revered the text, he was very clear in his mind that if there was anything in the Ramcharitmanas which was reprehensible, his sensibility, which did not pass his test of the conscience, then he would reject it. Such as that notorious passage which says that women and drums and donkeys are only fit to be beaten. You know, the passage in Tulsidas. Okay? So he was very clear about that there are passages there that are not acceptable and should be discarded. But that did not stop him from revering the text. Right? Mirabai is another person who I think was very dear to him. Right? So one could go on in this fashion and speak about the ways in which he had a certain kind of intellectual, lyrical, poetical, emotional, and moral attachment to certain writers, certain bhakts, certain sants.
Yes.
But in my view, ultimately, Mohandas Gandhi would have been Mohandas Gandhi with or without any other intellectual tradition. Let me explain what I mean. There has long been a discussion, and I've had differences of opinion with some very dear friends of mine who are very great scholars of Gandhi as well on this particular matter. So one of my closest friends with whom we've done three books together. I'm speaking of Ashish Nandi. Ashish Nandi has very often spoken of the fact that all of Gandhi's gurus were really Western gurus. Right? You had Henry David Thoreau, you had John Ruskin, you had Tolstoy, to some degree, Emerson, and then, of course, you had,
above all, Christ.
And I was about to say, and of course, Jesus with Sermon on the Mount.
Yes.
But you see, gurus in the plural are jealous of their territory. In other words, when you have too many gurus, you have no one. Okay, because Gandhi also refers to Gokhale as a guru. He
Yes.
also refers to Rai Chand Bhai as a guru at one point.
Yes, yes.
No one has that many gurus.
Yes, yes.
Gandhi would have been Gandhi with or without any of these people. He may have arrived where he was in a different way. And I'm not saying that, for example, that the Sermon on the Mount was not critically important. I'm not saying that Tolstoy's The Kingdom of God is Within You was not important. I'm
Yeah.
not saying any of that to Gandhi. What I'm saying rather is that Mohandas Gandhi was carved in ways and fashioned in ways, and he fashioned himself in ways that we cannot fully comprehend if we keep on thinking about what were all the influences on his life, including these sons, you see. Okay, he's moved by them. He holds them in very high regards. He speaks very highly of all of these people. But I can tell you that if Henry David Thoreau had never written his essay on civil disobedience, Gandhi would still have come to where he was.
Yes.
And there is, in fact, a real discussion that we can still have on how important any of these particular texts was. Gandhi tells you that he discovered Ruskin when he was on a train journey
Yes.
in South Africa,
South Africa.
right? And that it transformed him. Well, you see, the fact is that before he undertook that train journey, long before he undertook it, he was already a rebellious character.
Correct.
Anyways, as a Gujarati, he left. How
Yes.
many Gujaratis left? He was outcasted.
Yes.
When he goes to London, long before he reads John Ruskin, who lived in London, right? But long before he read John Ruskin, when he lived in London, what does Gandhi do?
Even in 1908, he translated Plato.
Yes. But you see, when he was in London, he embraced the other West.
Yes.
That is, he took up with all those people who were considered marginal within their own civilization. The vegetarians, the cranks, the theosophists, these were all people who were in some ways already marginal to the dominant.
Professor Vinay Lal, now as I mentioned in the very beginning, the issue is now the Zoom says that we have got another 5 more minutes. Now I do not know what to do. This is such an amazing, outstanding work. I wanted to request all of these viewers of Dilli Dali, listeners of Dilli Dali, that try to get this book. It is so well produced, with full of images, and the images, most of them we have not seen it anywhere. One question I wanted to ask you before getting over, let me quote a small portion from the book. In his influential study of art and Indian nationalism until 1922, Partha Mitter makes the claim that Gandhian movement aside, there was no revolutionary environment for the artists to be drawn into. You also placed a counter argument by Christopher Pinney. You already mentioned about him earlier, saying about the role of the mass-produced art in the colonial India. Now, my question is how the parallel movement. Suppose you quote Savarkar a lot in the book. Now, how the parallel movement of the Hindu militancy or a parallel movement of the communists. You mentioned Chitta Prasad in chapter 6 and 7.
Yes.
Now, the parallel movements of the communists and Hindu militancy, what was their engagement with art?
Well, very considerable. In the case of Chitta Prasad, and so now, the Delhi Art Gallery, DAG, something like 15, 20 years ago, maybe 2 decades ago, they did a whole show on the works of Chitta Prasad,
yes.
and they came out with a huge 2-volume work.
Oh.
But you see, that work has never been integrated. The work of Chitta Prasad has never been integrated in the manner in which I seek to do into a history of the art that was being produced on the whole,
Yes.
right, during the freedom struggle. And And wherever one's personal sympathies might lie, that's a different matter. That he is a very significant artist. The empathy that he had for the poor, the working class, the work that he did on the Bengal famine, when he actually traveled to the districts where famine had struck so many people. Right? One of the many atrocities which must be laid at the doors of the British, undoubtedly, in my view. Right? Not in some crass sense that this was deliberately engineered, but British policy was fundamentally responsible in creating the Bengal famine, as it was in creating famine in Ireland in the 19th century, right? And as it was in some respects in creating famines in India earlier. Now, one of the persons who I think through his art is able to evoke the suffering of the people, right? But do it in such a fashion that you don't just feel pity for the person, that what it evokes is not just pity and empathy, but also a certain kind of anger and a certain kind of humanism, all at the same time. And the work of someone like Chitta Prasad is very glorious. But let me take a very different dimension in the minute and a half that remains, which is that I do have an entire chapter on Bhagat Singh and the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, just as I have an entire chapter on Subhash Bose.
Yes. I loved a photograph, Rani Lakshmi Bai, heroine of the War of Independence of 1857, published in 1926 from San Francisco, and the publication's name was the United States of India.
Yes.
Now, the United States of India's title is more relevant at the present day regime when a One India theme gets currency.
So, I think I should explain for those who will be listening in to the podcast that the image in question that you're speaking about is an image of the Rani of Jhansi, Rani Lakshmi Bai. The image describes us as heroine of the War of Independence of 1857, and it appears in a publication called the United States of India. It's a periodical that came out from the United States, and it came out from San Francisco. And this particular issue, volume 3, came out in May 1926. Now, this image is extraordinary in many ways. The first thing to consider here is it's coming out from San Francisco. It's coming out from the diaspora. Moreover, San Francisco in particular is important for the story because the Ghaddar movement, which is also it's part of the history of the Indian diaspora, it's part of the history of radicalism, it's part of a story of how connections were forged across the oceans, across vast spaces, so to speak, with nodal points in many parts of the world. The Ghaddar movement is located in a number of places. Right? So when we think about this image, we have to think about that history, which I have invoked, but it is critically important that this idea of a United States of India, obviously inspired by the United States of America, the federalist structure. See, in the diaspora, it's easier to imagine it because you can overlook the differences that you would have to think about within India. After all, when Gandhi came on the scene, what happened? Right? Just think for a moment. A Gujarati essentially took over the movement in some ways. Hitherto, at that point in time, the two most important places, at least until 1915, had been Maharashtra on the west coast and, of course, Bengal. And there is no question that when Gandhi comes, the epicenter of Indian politics shifts. Right? So you can imagine all of that. But this image is also significant for other reasons. Now let's go to Rani of Jhansi. Because, in a sense, the Rani of Jhansi, even though the very title signifies the place to which she is attached, she became universalized in a way. And of course, the gender dimension is very important. And so, if you notice that one of the things I mentioned is that it was sometimes said of the Rani of Jhansi, in fact, a British official said,
Yes.
keeping in mind what I had mentioned earlier, that there are no men in India, that she is the only man in India, right?
Yes.
And one thing I didn't mention there explicitly because it was inferred in many ways,
Yes.
and it's a very complicated argument that I didn't really have the space to develop here. I've developed it in a number of other places. But just as she was the only man in India, Mohandas Gandhi was the man who was really the woman, as some of his critics charged, you see, right?
Yes. The
So
femininity in him. Yes.
yeah, so if you bookend the freedom movement, 1857, Rani of Jhansi, the only man in India, and then Gandhi, the man who became androgynous, who argued that every man should cultivate the woman within him, and every woman should cultivate the man within her.
In fact,
Right?
you saved a question. I had a question with me when you mentioned in the book. There had been very occasional representation of Kasturba or Kamala Devi Chattopadhyaya or Vijay Lakshmi Pandit or Sarojini Naidu. Now, apart from the Rani of Jhansi,
that there is um, there is no doubt that especially middle class women
hmm,
who had been confined to the home,
hmm,
that they went out into the streets for the first time.
hmm,
It was the Congress movement led by Gandhi which made it possible for women to enter into the public sphere in significant numbers.
hmm.
Let's not forget that Sarojini Naidu led, for example, the Darshana raid on the Darshana salt works. Kasturba herself, her role is now beginning to be appreciated to a much greater extent. And this goes back to South Africa. When Gandhi himself was imprisoned, Kasturba stepped into his place. And Kasturba was also arrested. Last year, I went to South Africa for my third visit, but for the first time, I went to Dundee at the courthouse, which has been preserved intact, where Gandhi and Kasturba were put on trial together in 1913. Right? And the role of women was very considerable. And again, it is his insistence on nonviolence, not only the way in which he tried to render himself into a woman in some ways, because he thought that women are more receptive to the idea of nonviolence, that the woman is a very image of the idea of nonviolent resistance, so to speak, right? That was part of the story. But he made a concerted attempt in many ways to bring women into the movement, and that history goes back to his years in South Africa. And we have to also bear in mind that there are other dimensions in which we can understand that. At his ashrams, the men and the women both performed the same duties. He might have said, indeed, he said very often that there is a gender division of labor, that the man goes out into the world, and to use the expression that is often used in English, he puts the bread on the table.
Yes.
Right? The woman takes care of the home. But you see, he's always aware of the constituency that he's speaking to. He is aware of the fact that this is the gender division of labor across all of India. If you speak into villagers in India, you cannot speak in the language of feminism. But what is critically important in Gandhi, and this cannot be said of anyone else, frankly, at all, is that Gandhi was far more radical in his practice, because he understood that in the Indian way of thinking, it is orthopraxy that we have to think about, right? That is, that we have to think about the fact that people adhere and learn from practices. The text can say whatever it does, but let's not be bound to the text. And this is also related to the point I made earlier about the fact that even when he revered a text, which was not often the case, there are only a few texts that he holds very dear. But even when he did, he always assessed that text to see whether it met the test of his conscience and the test of what we might call rationality in a way. Right?
You mentioned that you have huge number of Gandhi pictures, images which were made during the freedom struggle, and there is more than around almost 100 of images even in this book, and some of them are especially these 1939, so the Kanu Desai's
Oh yes, 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 yes.
images, and Prabhu Dayal's Bhagavan Ki Takli. My God,
Yes.
these are amazing images which you have put in this book. There is no question about it. I don't have any question to ask about that. Now,
Yes.
another question I wanted to ask was importance of Charles Ball, the history of the Indian mutiny, as far as the splendid images that you have done in this book.
Yes. Yes. You see, so for the early period, we don't, because the book is a study of how artists in India thought about how did they represent it in their work. Now, clearly, the images from Charles Ball's work, these are not by an Indian. Okay, this is a work that is produced for consumption back in England. But there I was handicapped by the fact that there isn't any work that I could find by Indian artists on the rebellion of 1857, 1858. I just couldn't. It's not there.
Yes.
And so there are very perplexing
the Indian side which you mentioned. The Indian side is lacking.
Yeah, it's simply not there. They're very perplexing questions. You might think that the Jallianwala Bagh atrocity, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which Gandhi himself said, described as, to put it very briefly, as a turning point. Yes. Many Indians who wrote about it, Nehru, many others, historians who wrote about it, they all described it as a turning point in many ways. And we know that it was something that was discussed in the House of Commons, where Churchill himself described it as a form of frightfulness. That has a long history, that word. It's a translation of the German Schrecklichkeit. So the idea was, that during World War I, that the Germans were engaged in certain kinds of Prussian tactics, scorched earth policies, as it were. Okay. And that we, the English, don't do what the Prussians or what the Germans do. Right? So Churchill was saying that what has been done in India is a kind of thing that you would expect the Germans to do. Now, I won't comment on that because this attempt to represent the English as softer than the Prussians, I think this must be seriously put into question. The reason I mention it is that even someone like Churchill recognized that the Jallianwala Bagh atrocity was indeed an extraordinary atrocity. And then, of course, logically, the question is, how did Indian artists represent it? And the answer is, we don't know. Because
even Salt Satyagraha.
Yeah, I couldn't find any works by Indian artists at that time. And one of the things I must say about this book is, you see, sometimes, many people have asked me, how many years did it take to write? Well, it didn't take years to write. Just tap into it. You have to create your own archive. You have to create, for a work of this kind, your own archive. You have to make a decision on how you're going to orchestrate the images so that they tell one kind of narrative, which is what these images seek to do. A few of them are very distinct. A few of them have never been published before.
Yes. No,
and the ones that have been published before have not necessarily been placed in this kind of context before.
It's amazing. It's an amazing work. And now in 1948, the pencil sketch by Upendra Maharani on Birsa
Yes.
Munda. It is simply superb picture. And
Yes.
then again, 1922, the Ali brothers with mother, that painting. That
Yeah.
is also very significant two images,
Yeah.
which is different from all other images in the entire book. I may quote this Birsa Munda and the Ali brothers, and
Yes.
I do not know whether I am wrong. The Ambedkar is whether Ambedkar images are around or not.
Well, two different parts to the question. One has to do with the Birsa Munda and
Ah,
the Ali brothers. See, the Birsa Munda and then the question about Ambedkar, which I'll get to in a moment. But see, the Birsa Munda, let me first say that Upendra Maharati uh, is a very significant Indian artist whose work
yes.
has been completely overlooked by most Indians.
Yes.
Um, the National Gallery of Modern Art, much to its credit, in Delhi, a few years ago, did an entire exhibition. I went there, and I was privileged enough to be able to actually see it all by myself because I got in touch with the director, and he assigned somebody to show it to me, and so I could photograph it and everything. But the Birsa Munda image I've been familiar with for a long time, and it was very important to include it because I wanted
Yes.
to also suggest that we have to start thinking about the Adivasi question.
Yes.
We
Yes.
have to start thinking about it. How does one think about the place of Adivasis at that time, and how does one think about them today? Because to be quite honest about it, um, we all speak about caste as, which is of course a question that uh, uh, is critically important, but very few of us think about the Adivasis. And I do think that the Adivasis have been very badly treated by almost every regime in India, including down to the present day. Every administration, every regime, they've been overlooked. And of course, this is apart from the question that Birsa Munda himself is historically a very
Yes.
important character.
Correct.
It's being produced at a time when the Congress was firmly behind the Khilafat movement.
Yes.
And my interpretation is very different than the dominant interpretation, even among the Gandhi scholars, because I think in the general public, everyone thinks that this was a fatal error on Gandhi's part.
Hmm.
Even most Gandhi scholars think that. I beg to disagree.
Hmm.
Because what Gandhi was attempting to do when he put the Congress behind the Khilafat campaign and said we must support the Khilafat campaign, what he was attempting to do was he was attempted to bring the Muslims who
Absolutely.
had gone into seclusion, so to speak, after 1857 to 58 when they were penalized by the British. He was attempting to bring them back into the public sphere in India. And it is a mistake to think that Gandhi promoted the Khilafat campaign because he anticipated the quid pro quo. In other words, that, all right, we'll support it. The common view is that Gandhi was being an opportunist. He was saying to the Muslims, we'll support the Khilafat campaign if you support the cow protection movement. Incorrect.
Correct.
Gandhi had a conception of the gift. When a true gift is what you give when you do not anticipate something in return. Okay.
Right. Right.
And the printmaker, by showing the Ali brothers with the mother,
Yes.
see, he's humanizing them in a way.
So great mother. In fact,
Yeah,
she was a
yeah,
great mother as well. No,
yeah, yeah. He's
went to
humanizing
jail
them.
when
Yes,
Annie Besant was arrested. She went to jail. No.
that's right. Yeah.
And one more
So,
thing,
so
this Khilafat movement. What I remember, these the first meeting of Gandhi's with Ali brothers happened in a Christian priest's house who was principal of Saint Stephen's College,
St.
Delhi.
Stephen's. Yes,
Ah,
yes, yes. Yeah.
what a times,
It's a very ecumenical history,
Yes.
which is impossible
Absolutely,
to convey
absolutely.
today.
I'm coming to the last part of the question. You know, I'm from Kerala, and this
Yeah.
book people like Subramanya Bharatiyar, even the cartoon movement, the cartoons,
Yes,
and
yes, yes.
from the southern part, there were pictorial representations during the freedom struggle and all. And I have a feeling that the book lacks it.
You're absolutely correct, but I am constrained by what I can find. See,
Yes,
think of
absolutely,
it this,
absolutely,
yeah, think of
absolutely,
it this way.
absolutely.
Are there photographs? Hardly any, just one or two.
Yes.
There are thousands of photographs. I had to exclude the photographs because there is a different body of work on photographs, and then photography is a different medium.
Different
And
medium.
then we're talking about a whole set of other considerations.
Yes.
Because when you're talking about photography, you're talking about, to use a famous expression of Walter Benjamin, you're talking about the age of mechanical reproduction. All right. So it's a very different set of considerations, and there was also been work done on photography. So I excluded
Them.
the whole discussion of photography.
Yes.
Similarly, I excluded cartoons, except for a very few, some very early
Very
cartoons.
few. You
Very
used
few.
only 2 or 3.
Yes, very few. Going back to the curves and the
Only
caricatures.
2. Actually, in fact, and
Yeah.
one is from the Westerner also.
Yes, and there are literally thousands of cartoons.
Oh, yes.
Now, so some of the omissions are deliberate. In the case of South India, because this is a point that has been made to me by others as well. In fact, when we had a book launch in Delhi, Professor Amar Farooqi, who had very kindly consented to be the discussant and who gave a very interesting set of remarks, he also mentioned, well, how does one think about South India? Where is South India in this? And of course, he's correct, just as you are. But the difficulty is that the art I'm looking at, the artwork, the prints, they're not coming from there. And I don't see, I couldn't find anything that is coming from there, you see, right? So there is, for example, a print which shows Rajaji,
Yeah.
right? Which shows Rajaji at the end.
Yes.
You'll see that. And of course, he's from the south.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
But the difficulty here was that I have to work with what I have, and then even if I'm creating, as I attempted to do, an archive as a right, but in this particular case, I am very much constrained by what I was able to find and what I was able to then work into what I called my own archive.
I understand.
Right?
And one answer, I jumped into another question. Therefore, you put in the answer about the question about the Ambedkar.
Yes. So look, I mean, I'm very straightforward about that. The first thing is that we can obviously take a very expansive conception of what we mean by freedom. Okay. Now, I would be the last person to deny that Ambedkar is a man who is fundamentally interested in the question of the dignity of every individual, right? And he is the principal architect of the struggle that was waged at that time and continues to be waged today by the Dalits to be treated as full human beings with the same kind of privileges, with the same attentiveness on our part to their dignity, to their conception of liberty, to their entitlements, all of that. The fundamental problem here is that this book concludes with the assassination of Gandhi, right? Essentially with independence, and the assassination of Gandhi is just a few months after that. The images we have of Ambedkar, first and foremost, really are generated in the aftermath.
Yes.
In the aftermath. We do not get images of Ambedkar really at that point in time. That's one problem. The second is, in what way do we describe him as part of the freedom movement as such? Okay. And it's not a question that people want to raise because, look, in some ways, Ambedkar himself has become, so to speak, a sacred cow. That is, that it's impossible to level any kind of critique of Ambedkar Although, for example, with respect to the Adivasis, I can only say that he had what I consider to be extremely derogatory views of the Adivasis. I don't think he even understood the tribal question in India at all, to be quite honest about it. But that is aside from the consideration that moved me, and the consideration here is one cannot really speak of him in that sense as part of the history of the freedom movement in India. One can speak of him as part of the history of the aspirations of Indians down to the present day, right? And especially the Dalits to be treated as full human beings. But for example, if there was Dalit art that was being produced at that time, I would certainly have used it. But I couldn't find any. I couldn't find any work by Dalit artists. Now, some of these artists might have been Dalits. Some of the works are anonymous. Some of these prints are anonymous. I don't know who did them. And some of them are signed by Prabhu Dayal. Some of them are signed by Roop Kishore Kapoor. But some of them are not signed.
Yes.
We don't know who produced them, right? So there are these
I think, we spoke about an hour on the book and the insurgency and the art of the freedom struggle in India. Without any doubt, it is one of the most important books got published in India in recent times. It is amazing, substantial work Professor Vinay Lal has done. Please accept my appreciation and congratulations for the massive work which you have done, and thank you for your quality time for this humble podcast, Dilli Dali. Thank you, Professor Vinay Lal, for your
pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you very much. I look forward to some conversation later. Thank you.